Hi, I'm Venessa Giunta. I am an author and an editor and an all-around like to talk about things person and a little awkward sometimes. One of my favorite things to do is talk to authors, right? I love talking to authors about their process, their writing, their careers, their marketing, all those things. And I really love just sitting down and just talking about stuff. I mean, communication is my love language. So that's really what I had in mind. I really wanted a situation where I could just have a conversation with somebody. And a conversation and a cocktail is really all about us hanging out and drinking together and talking about the stuff. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the show. And please say hello to Mike and his guest. So, Mike, if you want to introduce yourself and your guest and tell us about it.
Hi, I'm Mike Jack Stoumbos. This is Lutra the parrot.
Lutra.
If she starts nibbling on my ear, I will move her to the other shoulder. If she nibbles harder, I'll move her to the back perch. Lutra the parrot accompanies me for a lot of writing time and also for a lot of these kinds of calls, which is a ton of fun and occasionally a huge surprise to people on the camera, especially when they don't know that she's a real bird and then she starts moving. They're like, that's a real parrot in the background there.
That's the best. I love that. And as a matter of fact, when we have our writing sprints and discussions and things, I love it when Lutra makes an appearance. Mm-hmm. So that makes me happy. So what are you drinking? What are you drinking?
This is a go-to white wine. It's a Boggle Chardonnay. It's like
wine person.
It's tasty, and I don't have to think too hard about it. It's like not expensive enough that I need to worry about it being an occasion. But it's still good. So like I
understand. I am drinking decaf coffee and cacao with Fennelly's salted caramel cream liqueur. A friend brought it to the house for my birthday party in May. It's very tasty.
Nice. Yeah. Earlier this evening, I had suggested to my wife making basically like the worst cocktail ever based on things that just sound like. And I was like, we'll put Baileys and bay leaves together. And
horrible.
Uh-huh. Yes, right up there with mimosa samosas. But yeah, every now and again you need to say stuff like this and just see how it sticks.
I feel like you and my husband would get along very well because he likes playing with words like that. Mm-hmm. He'd be totally down, I think, for trying all those crazy things.
I don't always try to put them in recipes, but I will say them out loud.
He would say them with you. You could be like a little chorus.
Yes.
So welcome to Conversation and a Cocktail. I'm so glad you could join me. I'm super excited to chat with you tonight. I want to start by asking you what I ask all of my guests. And I would like to know, what is your origin story? Where did Mike, the author, like how did your writing start?
This is a good question that can have like many different versions in terms of long, medium, and short. We're going to go for short-ish. So I am a theater kid, musical theater kid. If there was an opportunity to stand me up on a coffee table and have me recite something at a very young age, I was going to do it. And yeah, this is one of those, I was recently in Northern Michigan, and a bunch of the aunties were saying something like, oh, Michael, when you were just like, when you were, 2 years old, we would have you just sit on Grandmaster's, like whatever kind of piece of furniture and, recite the beginning of whatever. So some of this just started from me being like a ham who likes stories and likes reciting things, and apparently much of my brain space went to memorizing things that maybe weren't super important, but oh well. And then over time, this grew into whenever we're playing with action figures or playing whatever kind of play pretend games, I was like, all right, we need to assign characters and casts and backstories. And eventually my cousins and siblings got into like, Mike, why can't we get to the fighting part of it? There is too much character development, which incidentally is still a criticism that I get from middle schoolers who attempt to pick up my books, and I'm like, yeah, that's fair.
Honest critique right there. Honest.
I do not try to tell them that it's a middle grade fiction. I tell the parents that it's not going to be inappropriate. But anyway, I digress. So yeah, I started a lot of my writing for stage because I was in theater communities, and there were some opportunities for me to write stage plays and get them out there.
Oh, cool.
And so yeah, so I had my first full length comedy produced when I was 17. And then I went on to write and produce another like 11 shows, I think, over the course of the next 5 years, through mostly like Portland through Seattle theater communities. Most of them pretty small. Some of them, I'm not going to say big, but some of them enough to pay a couple months of rent and
nice,
which is cool. And then I veered into the cool. I have done the theater thing enough to get my bearings there. I've gone through college and studied English, literary theory and analysis, yay, because I'm going to be a teacher. And then I had as my list before becoming an English teacher, I want to have published a novel, and I want to have worked as a year as a writer and editor in any capacity. And I'm like, these don't have to be massive successes. These just have to be enough that if a student asks me about it, I'm not just deer in the headlights thing them, or basically waving them off with some version of like, oh, well, that's complicated, or oh, like only 1 in a million actually make it in that. I'm like, well, that's BS. I mean, like, there are people who are going to show up and put in the effort, and they want to know where to go with this. So yeah, so it was part of my kind of sort of mission statement before I became a teacher. It's like, if I'm going to teach English, I'm going to have some idea of how to do this professionally. So yeah, so I spent a year doing nothing but writing and editing as a form of income. That was hard. That was really hard at like age 21 when I didn't know any of the industry or any of the connections, but I did it. And then I published a novel. I self-pubbed a story that I initially concepted as a musical, but didn't know enough about scoring to write the musical behind it. That one's called The Baron Would Be Proud. That is not currently published, and it's one that my wife tells me that I should republish because, it's a romantic folklore musical comedy in novel form.
That is awesome.
And then I went on to teach, and it was several years of teaching, trying to figure out, okay, how do I get to that part-time teacher, part-time writer, and then eventually let the writer become more and more full-time, and that was not happening. So I eventually had to make a more determined switch, and I can talk more about that if we go down that. But yeah, that's sort of like the practical staircase for where I was going and what I was studying and what I'm interested in, and why sometimes, like, when I'm in a discussion with somebody about whose blaster is the biggest in science fiction, I might reference Shakespeare. These things just sort of happen for me.
Everything is connected.
Yeah.
So one of my favorite parts about doing this show with people I already know, I don't always do it with people I already know, relatively well, but I always learn shit that I didn't know. Like, I had no idea that you started out with script writing, like playwriting. So I think that is fabulous. So you are very well-rounded as a writer, because I know that you then went into like the earlier, also currently, I think, but you went into short stories specifically with a focus. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, what was your goal, focusing on the short stories for a while?
Yeah. So for me, writing short stories is something that I had started at I think a much earlier age than I found out a lot of other authors do. Like, a lot of people are like, I want to write that big, great American novel, or I want to write the next Choose Era that you grew up in, the next Wheel of Time, the next Lord of the Rings, the next Name of the Wind. These were the communities that I was in. I tended to lean more sci-fi, but even so. Yeah. But I pulled a lot of influences from a couple people in my family who were like diehard Twilight Zone fans, and would give me short story collections that related to the Twilight Zone. So like, reading these like sort of ratty old bindings of like Theodore Sturgeon and Isaac Asimov short story collections, like a couple different renditions of like Heinlein novellas that I would revisit and be like, oh, I read this in a different collection where it totally felt different just because the font size was different. And like, so so I grew up on that, and I started trying to write my own short stories, mirroring Twilight Zone episodes and mirroring those others that I'd read. But that was a thing that I did just for fun. I had no idea that there was a way to break into the industry doing that. So that didn't start until quite a bit later. So when I was teaching high school, and I'm going to use the polite word drowning, in being a public school teacher. The only thing that I would really have time for was these occasional short stories. I would just I'd pick out an idea that I really wanted to tackle, and I would try to hammer out a draft as quickly as I could, while it was still fresh in mind, while it was still exciting. And during this process, I had put together a collection of some science fiction explorations, and these were all different kinds of what ifs that I just thought would be a lot of fun. That I knew, I couldn't write stage plays at the time. My schedule didn't fit that. I didn't feel like I could commit to novels, even though I wanted to, and I had 3 or 4 back burner novels that I hoped to one day get back to, and so on and so forth. But yeah, this is a very familiar story for a lot of people. But on the short story side of things, I had written a collection of alternate history science fiction pieces. That there's a much longer story into this that I'm not going to get into, but I went to a convention, Emerald City Comic Con in Seattle, and was like, you know what, I'm going to go try to meet authors, because among the other authors that I know are showing up, one of them is Kevin J. Anderson, and one of the first full-length novels that I had read was Jedi Search, and I went and saw a talk from Kevin J. Anderson, and he talked about writing a series in actually a very similar stylistic vein as the short story series that I was working on. This is not a story of immediately Kevin adopted me and yeah. So that'd be great. Not knocking him or anything. I've really liked getting to know and working with Kevin over the years. But in this case, this was kind of like me just sending out scattershot opening conversations to anyone that I could talk to at that convention. And there was one author there, Aaron Michael Ritchie, who read the opening of one of my stories, said he thought it sounded good, told me about the Superstars writing seminars, and told me in particular about an opportunity to submit a story to try to publish through them. So I was like, cool, that sounds nice, but I don't think I'll do it. And he contacted me a little while later. He's like, hey, here's the specs of the call. Here's when this window closes. You should get in on that. And I'm like, well, hot dog, I'm going to do that. And so I, wrote a story under 5,000 words that I thought, fit a nice 3-act structure. And I'm like, cool, I have now submitted my first short story ever for publication. I'm going to get my first rejection ever for a short story. That will be a milestone marked off, but I've done it and I feel good about it. And that one was accepted. And that was a very weird circumstance for me. I did not expect it. I don't think a lot of people in retrospect would have expected it. And it turned out to be for a bigger, a higher shelf volume than I had also expected. So that one is the Dragon Riders Compendium. That one, it starts with Brandon Sanderson, ends with David Farland, has Jody Lanai, Todd McCaffrey. It's
all big names.
Yeah. So I was one of 26 authors in there, and that was my debut. And I'm like, wow.
You kind of tripped and fell into it.
This is a change in expectations. Yeah, that was in 2016. Weirdly enough, most of the origin story doesn't pick back up until 3 years later because #teaching. But that was how I got started in the short story game. Most of the things that people would have heard about my short story side of things would start in the latter half of 2019 or even in 2020, when I started trying to do the more deliberate Bradbury challenge, the write a short story a week, because you can't write 52 bad short stories in a row.
That's true.
And so I kept trying to do this short story in a week formula, just to try things out. And I wrote quite a few bad ones in that process, but I also wrote some good ones, which included my first pro sale, at 8 cents a word there, and the story that ended up winning the Right of the Future contest was also from that stretch of write a story each week and just see how it goes. And so by the end of that one, I'm like, I feel like I not only have a lot of very demonstrable interest in this, but also by now I'm building some demonstrable skills and I'm learning the market better. And I'm able to pull from a lot of my writing and reading background as somebody who does legitimately really love science fiction short stories. And then I started being able to take that to more and more conferences and conventions as a teacher. And I'm like, okay, I have the teacher training. I now have some writing and publishing experience. And I also have just a personal background in like, I can set a goal and make myself hit it in terms of word count. And the combination of the three ended up being really nice for putting myself out there and saying like, hey, here's a thing to try. Your mileage may vary, but let's have a go at it.
I think that's a really important. Let me say hi to Anita and JD. Hey, y'all.
Hello.
I think it's something that novice writers and even writers who've been around a while, we sometimes lose sight of if we get sidetracked by life. Really, the things that go into a writing career are those three things you mentioned, right?
Yeah.
You know, you have to make time for your writing. You have to understand the writing. And I don't remember what the third one is, but it made sense.
Yeah. I mean, for me, that was the teaching component was a part of it, but that's my personal journey. Not everyone's going to be a teacher, you know,
right.
in terms of their own history or
yes.
or they're interested in it. But like, yeah, that's
yes.
That's
Mike is a pirate with his lute on his corner.
Yes.
Well, I think that the teaching comes in, obviously for not for everyone, but once you hit a certain level, and it's not even really a difficult to reach level in publishing, and if you are going to conventions, then you are going to be asked to be on panels, right?
Yeah.
You're going to, I mean, ideally, and that's what kind of panels are. They're little snippets of teaching people stuff.
Yep.
You know, so if you've got that background, it's really going to help also. I mean, obviously it's not required to write,
Sure.
but so then, I don't know if y'all know this, but then Mike went off into, I mean, Mike also has novels and we'll get to that too. But right now we're talking about short stories, JD, and stuff. So then Mike got this idea of doing anthologies. So tell me, the first anthology you did was Murderbirds?
Yep, that's the first one where I'm the lead editor. I've been involved in different parts of the behind the scenes process for other anthologies. So, you know, once I was writing for anthologies, I would look for opportunities to volunteer as a slush reader. And I think that is a great thing to do. Like my writing quality, and in particular, my get to the point by the first 500 words ability really increased once I started slush reading. So I will put that out there for anyone who's interested in like upping their short story game. Find a place to volunteer to read submissions that come in. It is a very good way to go.
Yeah, and for those who don't know, that's what it is. It's reading stories that come in before they go to the main editors. Yep. And it's also super helpful, especially those who, you know, have, like, when you get hundreds and hundreds of submissions, if there's only one or two editors for the anthology, that's a lot to read to get, you know. So if there's a level of slush readers first, it's very helpful for the editors as well. So it's very much symbiotic. I learned a lot when I used to read slush too. You really learn two big things. You learn what not to do, and you also learn that you're way better than you thought you were, comparatively speaking.
You also get to reinforce some of the things that you like and that you dislike, which I also think is important. I think there are a lot of people who are in the short story submission gauntlet and might get very disheartened by what they feel like they're seeing publish.
Right.
And if what you're feeling you see publish is something that you honestly would not like to read, it can be hard to like shoehorn yourself into that, because to some degree you do have to kind of like what you write. Maybe it's not a have to, but I think for long-term sustainability, it's a good idea to enjoy what you write, at least in
absolutely.
Part. And in slush reading, you can get a sense of, you know, there are some things that might not fit what you think is 100% the mold for everyone, but it's like, I like this, and it's weird and different, and I could do this kind of thing too. But anyway, so I was involved in, you know, as a slush reader for a couple different groups, and I wanted to know some of the behind the scenes process of the editing and production side. And so, like, after I'd sort of compiled what I figured was enough knowledge to get going, I was like, all right, I'm going to start putting together some anthologies of my own. And for like about 6 to 9 months on Zoom calls, usually productivity calls, I would just toss out titles and concepts of individual stories or anthologies, I have a long list of potential anthologies and potential themes. And one of them that I kept trotting out because I really wanted to put it together was a sort of creature feature series that didn't take itself too seriously, where you could like have each one themed on a certain type of animal. And so on a couple occasions, I actually got to stumble into some nearly organic conversations. Nearly organic is the key, about Murderbirds. And
Murderbirds!
and that was something that I was able to generate some interest in the overlapping communities. This idea of let's set up a collection of worst case scenarios about birds. So science fiction, fantasy, and horror twists on birds, mostly inspired by real world birds, and every one of them with intent to kill. And so I put that out there as a call in a few specific like author education and support communities. This is a phrase that I use a lot. Author education and support communities, like that rolls off the tongue by now. I repeat that ad nauseum, because that's the group. Those are the groups that I pull from, because those are the groups that I'm involved in, that I teach with, and
it's also where the writers are.
Yeah,
it's specifically where the writers are.
I worked with some editors, and like even some that I didn't work with that I just chatted with. They would frequently, I'm going to say complain, my apologies for any editors that I'm talking about here, but they frequently complain about the large amounts of slush they would get from people who were not in these groups, who maybe didn't know the submission specs, who didn't know some of the industry standards, who would send them memoirs when they asked for short stories.
There's a certain level of professionalism that is taught in those specific types of groups.
Yeah. And I'm seeing a lot of people who are putting together these anthologies, and they frequently are working with people that they already know and have already worked with in the past. I'm like, well, why send it out there for hundreds and hundreds of people,
right,
when you're going to end up working with most of the same people anyway? Now, there are some people who break that mold and do it really well. There are some people who have like the big enough teams and the infrastructure to make that work. But there are a couple editors that I've worked with that tend to put out like small community calls, and they do really well with them. And I really like the products that they turn out, and they don't seem to be lacking for not putting it out to the entire world. Yeah, Lisa Mangum and Lynn Worthen are two people that I've worked with. Like I've sent stories to them, and they've accepted and published my stories as editors. So I've liked working with them. I've liked watching their models, and they're people who tend to pull from more specific communities, not all the time, but a majority of the time, or at least in the times that I've worked with them. And so with Murderbirds, I was like, let's keep it in community. Let's try to look for some people who are, for my part, reaching, like, you know, I'm going to say above my level. I'm like, can I rope these people in and be like, hey, this would be an awesome thing. I know you'd be doing me a huge favor. I am going to definitely pay you, but probably not as much as you're worth. What are you okay with for a reprint? And then also looking at people who are winning their first award or putting out their first novel, or had, you know, recently had a couple of paid sales. And then also looking at people who are very involved in these communities, who are just like, you know, these forces of positivity in these forums, and they're always posting awesome stuff, and they're working on getting their first sale. And so between those ones, I was like, I have a plan, I have a mission, I have a way that I can get these folks together and look for a certain brand of enthusiasm, also in the tone of the stories themselves. So it ended up not being a very dark anthology. With a name like Murderbirds, we did not take ourselves too seriously. Some people thought we did. And I guess that's your go-ahead, but like, you know, it's called the Unhelpful Encyclopedia series. And the first one is Murderbirds, the second one is Murderbugs, third one is Murderfish. And I kid you not, for the third one, Murderfish, so we're doing, you know, A is for Avian Anthology, B is for Big Book of Bugs, I am not sure if someone's going to talk me out of this, but I really want to just write C is for sea creatures. And if I decide to go nuts with it, I might say C is for Nidarians. Nidarian starts with a silent C. It's CNID. But like, because these are the kinds of things.
You're such a nerd. I love that.
Yeah, these are the kinds of things that I find funny. And you know, being able to have like a creature feature anthology that doesn't take itself too seriously, that is very on theme for people who like a certain kind of animal, it's just fun. It's like when I take these ones to anthologies, when I take these ones to conventions, there are people who will see Unhelpful Encyclopedia and be like, that sounds awesome, tell me more, and they'll buy it. There are people who will see that it has to do with birds. They'll see a feather on the front. And we'll get to talking about Lucha the Parrot because they're like, oh my God, I have cockatiels and they are hilariously murderous. Look at this scar on my hand. And they'll buy a book. And it's a fun way to talk to people about it. It doesn't feel like I'm doing repeats of what I see in a lot of other anthologies. There are a lot of anthologies out there that are great, but there are some that I think are hard to pitch because they don't have a strong enough theme that people can just attach to when they see the title and the cover. And so this
also,
was
your whole series of anthologies has the theme, right?
Yeah.
So like you've got themes inside of themes.
Yes.
So
Yep.
I feel like that makes it easier to pick. JD has a question as well.
Yeah.
Is an anthology way harder than what you thought, or in line with expectations? Putting one together.
This is going to come back to bite me. It was not as hard as I thought it was going to be. And part of this, I think, was because a lot of people were trying to prep me with horror stories. There were a lot of people who were like, don't ever do anthologies. They will be a waste of time and money. And I can see that. I will also admit that I am somebody who loves themed short story collections. Like, I personally love that. So being able to do it as, to some degree, a labor of love was also okay for me. So it was one of those things where I'm like, yes, I want to make money. And yes, I think I figured out how to leverage the time so it's a decent enough return on investment. But at the same time, I was like, all right, if this is one that basically breaks even, will I be fine with it? And I decided, yes, I'm going to be fine with it.
We'll call it a win.
I will have an editor credit that goes up on my list of books. And to some degree, that's like a mark of community legitimacy.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so being able to put out an anthology that also successfully funded on Kickstarter, and we're able to get a lot of enthusiasm for the next one. I mean, we definitely had a lot more submissions for Murderbugs than we had for Murderbirds. So being able to have those things, it does feel like a mark of professional growth. So to answer JD's question, it ended up being, I'm going to say, more rewarding for the time that I put in than I thought it would be. If I say easy, that might be misleading or an unfortunate thing that people will come back and get mad at me for, but more rewarding for the time I put in than I expected.
Maybe it was easier than you were led to believe.
Yes. Easier than I potentially feared and braced myself for.
Yes. But I think it's good. I would much rather, plan for the worst.
Right.
And then get something better than that. That's always I think an excellent plan.
Yeah.
So, but you also have novels. You also write novels. So, what I know that you've written novels in shared worlds, and you also have your own.
Yep.
Okay. So.
Yeah. So, well, here I will hold up Signal. This is the Signal Out of Space, book 1 of this fine crew. When I'm at conventions, I will often start the sales talk with Starfleet Academy, where more shit goes wrong. And if I'm talking to people where I shouldn't say shit in front of them, I will say stuff. But in some places I'll say Starfleet Academy with very non-human perspectives, because I like to dig into the super non-humanoid aliens and talk about why they work the way they do. But yeah, this fine crew, I sold initially as a trilogy to Chris Kennedy Publishing, and so this was my first novel that somebody else produced. And actually, considering that I've only done the one self-pubbed one before I started teaching, so it was my second published novel, and it was pretty cool to be able to get it off the ground as a trilogy. So wrote The Signal Out of Space, A Rupture in Time, and Seed in the Sky. And then afterwards did The Impossible Moon, and between The Impossible Moon, which is sort of, it continues the series, but it is a little bit more of a standalone mission. And then book 5 is another sort of standalone mission. Between those ones, I was invited to write in the Four Horsemen universe. The Four Horsemen universe, if you are not familiar and have any interest in military science fiction, it is military science fiction that essentially has mech suits and a list of aliens that in some ways seem like uplift Earth animals. This is an oversimplification, but those are going to be usually the main common threads. And in this universe, there are, I'm going to say, 84 books currently out in this universe. This is not a contiguous series, so you can jump in a lot of different places, and on Amazon and also on the website, they will make note of the start of some of the series arcs. We'll jump in with those. I have a shifting parrot. Actually, I'm going to pop the parrot back here. And I will give the parrot an almond to appease her for the moment.
Okay, she was a good girl.
Oh yeah, no, she's been doing great. Yeah. So yeah, so I'm not sure. Oh, I see it on the screen. So yes, the little gray one on the green chair, Defenders Rise.
Joe, do we have the bigger version of the
Pop it up.
gray one that
I
maybe
can
we can pop up?
also. Oh no, I don't have a copy up here. There are ones downstairs, but I don't have a copy up here that I can get for myself.
We'll have the links are going to be the links for all the stuff that's going to be down in the show notes. So.
Yeah, so Defenders Rise is my first novel in the Four Horsemen universe. I also have a novella, some kind of long form short story, in a collection that was also recently released in there, and that was the Phoenix Initiative First Missions.
Oh, there it is.
Rise. Yes.
It took them a second to find it.
Yep. Defenders Rise, where I pitched the thing that they're looking over is like, can we get like a space age like Isengard with like a an air traffic control tower that looks like the Tower of Orthanc?
That is fabulous.
The Lord who presides over it, yeah, and that is that was what I was going for the cover concept. So yeah, we're there.
I feel like you got it. I feel like you got what you were looking for.
Exactly.
Nice.
Yeah. So Defenders Rise is about and I'll note in advance for anyone who's worried about spoilers in the series and wants to know kind of where to start. There are a lot of them that can be read as standalones. This one I put out as standalone with sequel potential. This is the professional industry way of saying, yes, we're starting with one, and if there's enough interest, then we'll continue. Yeah. So Defenders Rise starts on it's referred to as a warship graveyard. So after many battles in orbit, a bunch of ships have crashed onto this planet and made it a terrible place to live, but a great place to salvage. And there's only one working port, and that has become sort of the place that runs the penal colony where everybody else lives and does salvage. The main character is a 2.5 foot tall uplift gecko named Rev, who is planning his escape, and while he is looking for supplies to get off planet safely, stumbles upon a cache of these mech suits, the Caspers, which are one of the sort of standard through lines in all the series. And they're made for people who are much taller than him. They're made for 6 foot tall humans. He's about 2.5 feet tall. And he finds a way to cleverly make it work for him well enough, but is caught in that process and needs to like pull in more people to help work with him. So it's like, oh, Drat, okay, fine, I will give you this many % of the enterprise to help you with this. And like, yeah, so it becomes a kind of amusingly unplanned found family, which eventually leads to an alien uprising and revolution. It is a lot of fun,
as found families often do.
Yeah, I typically pitch it as The Moon is a Harsh Mistress meets Seven Samurai, and it is legitimately 7 characters who are leading this revolution, all of whom come from species that are in other books prior, but they're usually the small non-agency victim characters.
Yeah,
I was like, let's play with these ones. Let's play with the uplift geckos. Let's play with the uplift nearly blind monkeys. Let's play with the weasel characters that everyone says are too afraid to actually stand up for themselves. I'm like, let's mess with this. So
it's like a whole book of underdogs.
Yeah. Yeah, that was part of the plan and part of the fun, because I wanted to be able to play with an alien culture that hadn't been developed much. Yeah. So I was meeting with the publisher, Chris Kennedy, this last summer, and we were talking about sort of like where the series would go from here. And he was like, you do know that you're now managing the canon for these 2 species. Like, they're yours now because you've set their cultural standards and more about their biology than anyone else did.
So, all right. You kind of volunteered without even knowing it.
Yeah. So we'll be continuing that one. It's kind of a question of when. The schedule has been somewhat rearranged with the numbers of things that I'm working on behind the scenes.
Yeah, you've got your fingers in lots of pies.
Yes.
I love that. So I was going to shift. You've talked about conventions. Do you do a lot of conventions?
I'm getting started with them in the last year or so. I'm very new to the convention scene. So pretty much everything that I've published has been in the last couple of years. So a lot of it is like just kind of me learning as I go very recently. Last year, I did 17 different author events in some form, between conferences, conventions, like online teaching events, and these are things that are like more than a couple hours of a podcast or an interview. So these are like events, and that was too many. So that's for people who are for the mathematicians in the audience, this is like a third of the weekends in the year were devoted to these things, and some of them were like once in a lifetime things. Like the Writers of the Future workshop, and being given the fancy award, and
you won that too. Don't skip over
Yeah.
that. Tell us
cool,
when you were talking about your short stories, you completely skipped over that part.
Sometimes I glaze over it. Yes. Yes.
Tell us about the Writers of the Future award.
All right. Well, here I will hold up the convenient image. So this is the illustration for that story. So the award-winning story, "The Squid Is My Brother."
I believe I read that. Before I knew you, I believe I read that.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. So "The Squid Is My Brother." I find it very funny. It was one of those stories that I had the concept for it for a while, and I wanted to play with it, but I never had a good way to do it. And then shortly into the COVID shutdown, I was a teacher who was trying to field the various like angry things that I was hearing at the beginning of COVID, where everyone was throwing around theories, and more than personally wanting to side with any political group at the time, I was like, how would I feel if I was a student in all this and like schools were shut down? I'm hearing various things about people dying of this plague. There are all these kinds of horror stories happening, and I feel like I'm in a new location and needing to learn from home, whether or not home is a safe environment, whether or not home is a good place to learn from, whether or not I feel like I have the tools to access whatever. And like, so this is the stuff that I'm going to think about. And I'm like, I needed to find a story that had to do with that attempt to transition into a new scary place in terms of school and try to work through it. And I couldn't find it. So I wrote it. So I wrote "The Squid Is My Brother" about somebody who was living on Neptune Station. There is a problem, an unknown danger to Neptune Station, and all of the children are sent back to Earth. On Neptune Station, the only way they can survive, however, is they have an alien symbiote attached to their spines. And so this girl, Micah Kessler, is sent back to Earth as part of an ambassador program as the youngest of the child ambassadors, and they're all sent to different schools with a tentacled symbiote attached to her spine that comes out of a hole in her backpack because it is considered too scary to be seen by the other children.
Oh, wow.
And I wrote that story, and it was this highly emotional experience where I'm like, I want to get into like this is scary while still being able to have a lot of hope and a lot of like lighthearted amusement to it, and the kind of thing where somebody could conceive of a child thinking through this process and then being able to look back on it as an adult and be like, there's a lot of humor and a lot of heart to this anecdote, even though like, wow, that would be a hard thing to go through. So when I wrote that one, I was like, cool, this has fit that need for me. It was a 2-day write. I hammered it out. It was about 7,500 words in its initial draft, and I felt like I got a lot out of it. And then I put it aside for a bit, reread it later, brought me to tears, made me laugh and cry in the same go, which is always a good sign. That has actually been a very frequent review for that story. And then when one of the Writers of the Future windows came around, I had a couple stories on my list that I wanted to send based on the things that I thought that the lead editor really liked, based on, workshops that I attended with him or things that I just heard from people in the forum. And the story that I had planned to send was in consideration somewhere else. And so I was like, oh, well, what else do I have that I really like? And so I'm like, I pulled out this weird one, "The Squid Is My Brother." And I'm like, I'm going to send this one in. And there was people in a writing group that I was in, they were like, oh, don't send that one. I'm like, wait, why? They're like, because it will never work. It will never sell. I'm like, wait, but why? And it's like, well, first of all, it's about a child protagonist. You can't get enough depth with a child narrator protagonist. And then somebody else was like, you can't sell a story that has like epistolary sections, because it's like it opens with a letter to her mother and it has journal entries in it. Like, it was very intentional how I structured them. It's a palindrome order. I'll like longer commentary on that later if people want to talk to me about that. But anyway, Yeah, and there was a third thing though. Somebody was like, "Yeah, no, this will never fly there. You won't be able to sell that there." And I was like, "Well, I like it. It's free,
Nothing to lose.
anonymous. If it gets rejected, oh well. Do I lose anything? No. I just
Right.
send it somewhere else later." And then and then I got the call when we were getting way too late in the year for it to make sense for as long as it had been considered, because like I turned it in December near the end of that 3-month consideration window, and I got the call in like April that I was a finalist.
Wow.
And yeah, and Joni Lubacki, who makes those phone calls, who always wants to be the one to to give the good news and hear the reactions to the good news, told me that I was a finalist, and I was like, oh, well, that's really cool. That's unexpected. Awesome, thank you. And she's like, yeah, is the story still in consideration here? And like asked the sort of disclaimer things to let me know what it entailed if it was a winning story.
Mhm.
And I was like, cool, yeah, we're good to go. Looking forward to hearing from you. And then like near the end of April, called me again to let me know very confidentially, because it hadn't been announced publicly yet. She's like, hey, you have to keep this under your hat because we are not yet able to go live with these because we're still getting in touch with some of the other authors. But you are the first place winner this quarter, and it was a unanimous vote from the judges. And I was like, wow, that's a thing. And my remark at the time, which Morgan was there to hear, Morgan's my wife, and will repeat to me, is that my reaction was, wow, I am one giant goosebump right now. And that, I can be quoted as saying that. That's fine. Yeah.
That is the best, though. I feel like that needs to be like a T-shirt or something.
Yeah, I'm a giant goosebump right now. Yeah. So that was my sort of like experience with that win. The other pieces that people often will sort of ask about, and that I'll talk about along the way, or before I actually managed to get from there to the award ceremony. So May 4th, Star Wars Day, was when they finally announced that win. Cool. Yay. I pro'd out. I became ineligible for the contest between then and when I actually got to go to Hollywood and win that award, which is a very cool thing. This is one of those things that I tend to advocate aiming for, because I know some people who really they want to set their sights on this contest. They want to win Writers of the Future before they've sold enough at a professional rate at 8 cents a word or higher, where they're no longer eligible.
Gotcha.
And I'm like, you should shoot for it. Like either way, send out to as many pro contests as you can along the way that you think your stuff would be vaguely a fit for. Might as well.
Mhm.
And it was very cool that by the time I showed up at this event, I had not only pro'd out from the contest, but by that point I had sold the trilogy, the This Fine Crew trilogy, and books 1 and 2 had already come out there. Actually, book 3 had just been released by the time we were there as well. But I didn't have large amounts of copies of that. But then, so yeah, I was able to show up to the Writers of the Future workshop and award ceremony, having gone from just getting my start to I have sold enough stories at the pro rate that I would no longer be eligible anyway, and I've sold a trilogy to a publisher and it is already released. We did a rapid release trilogy there, and so when we were doing our tour of like Galaxy Press and their library, they asked if we had any questions in the tour. I raised my hand and I was like, is it presumptuous for me to ask if you want copies
For the
library? Because one of the things they prefaced was that they wanted to have like every novel published by their past winners.
Yeah.
And Joni, great supporter. Like, yeah, Joni Lubacki and Jod Goodwin are amazing in a lot of ways for like so many authors. So I will gush about them if given the opportunity. And Joni was like, yes, that's wonderful. Yes, sign them to us and we will put them up there. And then earlier this year when the next group was doing the tour of the library, somebody apparently saw it facing out on a shelf, snapped a picture and sent it to me. It was like, I found this at the library. And I was like, that's just great. That's awesome. So yeah. So I can't say that I was aiming at the Writers of the Future contest as the one and only. It was one of many publications that I thought would be really awesome. But for me, more important than winning the award itself was like between the win and getting there, the number of things that I was building momentum on.
Yeah.
So that I could be like, this isn't a one and only. This isn't a one and done. This is a launch pad. This is, this is something that I want to be able to take and keep growing. and also to continue to work with others who are in the process of growing as well, at various stages of the journey, which brings us back to things like, the anthologies.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think there are a lot of authors, especially those first starting out, but also even people who are further along, who are focused solely on novels. Without really realizing, just like you said, you didn't really realize that you could sell short stories. It's probably, I won't say easier, but it takes less time, generally speaking, I think, to sell short stories. I mean, you've got to, in some cases, it's almost like a curated spray and pray, right? Like, you have like this, you've at least narrowed your markets down to where you want to send it, and then you just send it out and just like hope for the best.
Yep.
But I think, and it really, I think, comes down to being a numbers game. It's like, the more you send out, and there are also a lot of authors, I find, novel writers specifically, who say they don't know how to write short. So that writing short is hard for them because everything turns into a novel. And I'm wondering if you have any advice for writers who have that mindset.
Yeah. I can also start by saying that I thought I was one of those writers at a time as well. Like, even though I really liked short stories, everything that I thought was a really interesting idea that involved like some kind of new innovation or building a world that I thought hadn't exactly been done in exactly that way before, seemed to turn into a novel when I was trying to learn to write fiction. And I'd said this to a couple adults in my life when I was a teenager, and they have since teased me about it, with very good reason. But I think that one of the great things to kind of consider is, I'm going to go to another workshop. If you look up, it was when Brandon Sanderson taught the 318R class, had it all recorded so people could audit it. It's available for free on YouTube. And during that process, he invited in a couple of guest lecturers, and one of them was Mary Robinette Quall, Lady Astronaut series. And she, did a walkthrough of a short story formula in a very active application of the Orson Scott Card mice quotient formula. Now, this is like a series of names peppered around, but the reason I'm saying this is because when she was able to walk through this one and talk to people about, like, what can you think about as a short story where you're starting as close to the moment of action, the moment of realization, the moment of decision that is going to make the meat of this short story as possible, what do you realize about it? What can you find out? And Brandon Sanderson was one of the people who was essentially taking that class with her, who had said that he basically wrote really long. And then he made the comment, it's like this very cheeky from the front row. It's like, oh, it's kind of just like writing another chapter. And that was hilarious. It was like, so it was like, after going through this intense formula, which is a really great formula, also getting on the other side, this very like, if you can write a chapter, and in that chapter, you can have a setup, a major moment of decision, major moment of realization, and then some kind of a smoothing out to an interesting or like iconic finish, or even a, oh, what's next in awe finish, then you can write a short story.
Yes. I love what Anita just said here. Writing short fiction is a great way to tighten your prose, especially flash or shorter. And I think that's smart. Please go on. I just wanted to make sure we highlighted that, because I think that's super smart.
Yeah. So like, I think some of it does come down to trying to figure out how to reframe it. There are a lot of people who are very used to writing novels because that's what they read. And people who grew up reading, I'm going to use The Wheel of Time as an example. If that's the one that you grew up reading, you're thinking about fantasy in those terms, you might be writing things that are only very long novel length.
Yes.
However, if you find more short stories that you like and model things after that, then that can work. If you watch sort of like serialized anthology fiction, you can also get into that. The Twilight Zone was where I started. One of them that I will recommend,
American Horror Story.
One of the other ones that I'll recommend is Love, Death, and Robots on Netflix.
I haven't watched that yet, but I've heard really good things about it.
There's one in I'm gonna say it's in season 3, but I'm not actually sure. It's a cartoon adaptation of The Very Pulse of the Machine, and it is absolutely beautiful. It is I have yet to find a better rendition of short story translated directly for screen that hits all of the notes in a very, very satisfying way. And it is really short. And you're going to get so much out of it if you are the kind of person who likes exploration science fiction. There are some people who might just be like, and people are wearing spacesuits and might be talking to aliens. I don't care. And if you're that kind of person, it might not be a thing for you. But if you hear spacesuits and talking to aliens, sign me up. Then yeah, it is a great example of very, very effective short fiction that focuses on a single event, single moment, and gives it like larger than life, bigger than the universe implications, but by focusing on a small moment. I don't know. Maybe that was in the wrong direction to say, but I'm here anyway.
No, I love that. I love that because I think when I talk to people who say they can only write novels, for me, and this is going to come off really crappy, and I apologize because it's not that bad in my head, but it comes like, to me, I think, well, that's because you haven't really tried hard enough yet, or you haven't really figured it out, because like, it's a really effective, like Anita was saying, it's a really effective way. I mean, to me, it means if you can only ever write long, if you don't have any ability to write short, it's because you don't know how to be concise with your words, or you don't know how to narrow your story, you know? Yeah. And that, I mean, like I said, it comes across really shitty like that, but in my head, it's not that judgmental, because it's not like I'm like, oh, well, that means you suck. Because, you know, like, that's not what I mean at all.
Yeah. I think another component of it is often also about what people are interested in reading.
Sure.
So one of the things that people will ask me about in the Writers of the Future side is they'll sort of want that advice on the short story front with, like, you know, writing a short story that will be a Writers of the Future winner, which is like, on one hand, it's like, okay, well, it's great that you seem to think that I'm authority on exactly what the editors are going to like, and I can't tell you that.
They picked a story about a squid coming out my back.
But one of the first things that I will often ask is, what kinds of short stories do you like to read?
Yeah.
I'm not going to be well versed in every short story out there. There are way too many for me to have read all of them. But if people start talking about styles of short stories, then we can engage in conversation and kind of figure out like what kinds of things they might be interested in. And maybe I can like give some additional recommendations or give some like thoughts on different exercises to be able to build out. Usually for me, I tend to focus on, are they talking about setting-based short stories, character-based short stories, idea-based short stories, or event-based short stories? And each of them do lend themselves to a most likely 3-act structure that is pretty commonly duplicated across any of those 4. It's not a perfect example, but it's actually a really nice way to learn it. But that's the longer commentary. But I will ask them what kinds of short stories they like to read. And a lot of people will say, oh, I don't really like reading short stories. They just want to win that contest.
Yes.
And I've gotten very good at not laughing.
You do better than me.
But every time I'm like, well, then maybe that's where you should start.
That's like, your assignment.
Like, if you really don't enjoy reading short fiction at all, then it might not be the kind of thing that you ever really enjoy writing. And that can be okay. It just depends on what your goals are and what you want to do to get there. And so for some people who want to like get to know editors and get to break into certain sections of the industry, writing short stories and being able to send those out quickly might be a good way to go.
Yeah, it feels like when people don't read short stories, but they want to win a contest like Writers of the Future, it feels very mercenary to me. You know, it's like, well, how is that going to improve your career if that's not a thing you want to do with any regularity, right? If you don't even read them, you know, it's like you learn from what you read. Like I can write horror, like without even thinking about it. I can write a horror scene and it will be a good horror scene because I spent my teens and my 20s soaking in horror, right? I don't even have to like plan it. I could just do it. It's fine. I mean, I'll have to edit it, but whatever, you know? And so the opposite is true. If you don't read a thing, like I don't read science fiction, I wouldn't be able to write science fiction for sure at all, period, you know?
Yeah.
I grew up reading Stephen King, short fiction, his novellas, and his novels and his super novels.
Yeah.
And so like, I have no concept of how long I can write. I just sit down and write.
When people talk about Stephen King adaptations into film, I'm not going to say this across the board, but I think some of the closest adaptations of Stephen King books to film are the ones that are based on like his novels or his novellas or short stories, rather than the huge things.
Yes.
Like making The Stand into a miniseries twice, that's reasonable. It's
Yeah.
huge.
Yeah.
Making The Langoliers into a feature-length film and being able to hit almost every line exactly is great. I am so in favor of that. I love that movie and that book. I know it's not one of the favorites. I love it. It was so much fun. Yeah.
But that also stands like trying to make The Gunslinger into a movie. That
I
didn't
did not
work.
see the movie.
Oh,
I read the
I
book.
mean,
I
it
did not
was
see the
fine
movie.
for what it was. It was an action movie. It was
Yeah.
as if someone adapted The Gunslinger to an action movie. That's
Okay.
exactly what it was. But because Gunslinger and all of the subsequent books are all so rich, you can't do that in 2 hours, right?
I feel like they would have had an easier time trying to do The Gunslinger in the way that Netflix did The Sandman.
Yes.
Where it felt like it was sort of a dream state serial piece where you weren't quite sure if there was definite direct cause and effect between each episode.
Well, I think that it would do better in that format period, just because it's so like they had to use creative license and change so many things in the setting and the story that then doesn't make sense for the later, what comes later in the series. It's like, but you broke it. We can't use it later if you break it.
Yes.
So, but I mean, don't get me wrong. I love me some Matthew McConaughey and Idris Elba. I mean, I was totally down with all of that. But for what it was a fun action movie. It just wasn't, But I agree with you that Stephen King's short work, all like Stand By Me, that's one of his.
I should at some point.
I don't know that I've seen it either, but like he won awards, right? So, but that was from his shorts. I don't know if it's a short or if it's a novella. I think it might be a novella. The Body. That's what it was. Shawshank Redemption is from a novella. Oh, he says short story. So the Body was a short story.
Our resident researcher. Yeah.
Yes, he knows everything about film. Like if I have a film question, Joe's the one I go to. Anyway, enough about Stephen King. He doesn't need to take up our airtime. So we've only got a couple minutes left. This has been so much fun. Do you have anything new coming? I know you're working on Murderbugs. I know that's in process. So what is next for you? What's coming up soon?
Yeah. So one of the big ones that we're ramping up for is the Kickstarter for both Murderbugs and the first in our second anthology series. We're going to be doing the Vampire Survival Guide, which is a little bit of a flip of what it sounds like. It is tales from vampires about how to survive humans. So it's basically going to read like if an armchair expert collected a bunch of stories like, this is what you really need to know. You're a new vampire, read these to survive. So yes, we're starting that. That's the first one of our Monstrous Guidebook series, and we're launching the Kickstarter for that the second week of September, I think, is when we officially launch.
After DragonCon.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. So that one is going to be going on. So Murderbugs, we've actually already, we already have the stories for Murderbugs. We have released the table of contents, and so that's various places over social media. It's very cool to be able to announce those. And then otherwise for my novellas and novels, some of them I can't quite talk about yet on account of what's going on behind the scenes and what has or hasn't been approved. But I do have a novella that's going to be coming out in the near future. So for people who are interested in somewhere between the short story and the novel, called Murder on the Barge Inn. And Murder on the Barge Inn is a space style take on Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None. It's fun. I enjoyed the heck out of it. So yes, and that one I'm thinking that's going to be like third week of August, if I remember right. And I should have those dates in front of me, but I don't.
So right before DragonCon.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. There we go. We can make things work around DragonCon.
Everything revolves around DragonCon and multiverse for me right now.
Yeah. And then otherwise in the works is book 5 of This Fine Crew, which has been pushed back a couple times due to life events. This is not foreign to a lot of authors either. But going to try to get that one wrapped up and turned in so that we can like look at a launch date by the end of this year if possible, and if not, early next year. And then other things that are going on behind the scenes that I'm not going to talk about yet.
Damn it.
Yeah.
All right, I guess that's okay. You can have your secrets. Y'all just have to follow Mike on social media to hear about them when they're ready to be announced. So all those links.
As of earlier today with TWT, I might end up starting a TikTok where I read passages in the voice of Golem for people.
That is awesome. That will totally take off too.
Yeah.
That will
I mean, like, when I said it out loud, I'm like, oh, this is the thing. I need to do this.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
TikTok.
Have you heard my Golem? You have not heard my Golem.
I have not. Give it, so our end phrase is there's always time to go indie now. So why don't you do that?
Okay.
Yeah, just 1 second. I want to thank everybody for hanging out today. You guys have been awesome. I want to thank you, Mike, because you've also been awesome. And
yes, precious, there's always time to go indie now.